Hello, I'm Carolyn Johnson, Communications Manager at Resource Futures, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Urgent Conversations webinar series, where we dive into key topics and issues affecting the waste and resources industry and how we can solve them. Today, we are asking whether extended producer responsibility, or EPR, can deliver the recycling transformation we need. First up, I would like to welcome Brian Lodge, Director of Packaging at the British Plastics Federation.
Good afternoon. Yes, my name is Brian Lodge. My background is in design and development of plastic, mainly packaging, which I've been doing for over 40 years now. And currently my role at the BPF covers legislation and the application of that legislation. So I'm looking forward to discussing this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Next, we welcome Jane Martin, former CEO at City to Sea.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. Yes, some of you may know me as my role as former Chief Executive of City to Sea, famous for the Refill campaign and the Refill app. I'm now working as a consultant in the packaging and reuse industry, still very committed to making reuse second nature. I'm founding the UK Reuse Alliance, which will be a voice for industry, and I sit on PAC UK's Communication and Behaviour Change Board on EPR. It's lovely to be here.
Thanks, Jane. Welcome also to Robbie Staniforth, Innovation and Policy Director at Ecosurety.
Hello, thanks very much for having me. So my background in extended producer responsibility is over, much more than a decade now, looking across packaging, but also waste electricals and batteries, which we hear much less about more latterly because all of the focus is on packaging. As well as my role at Ecosurety, I'm also on the steering group of PAC UK. The announcement only happened on Monday. So glad to be sharing that news with you. So I'm helping PAC UK to shape the future of extended producer responsibility for packaging because they're the scheme administrator who is managing all the money that's flowing around the system from producers all the way through to local authorities. Finally, I'm also the co-host, I should say, of a weekly podcast on all things packaging, EPR, recycling and reuse called Talking Rubbish. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Robbie. And finally, our very own CEO of Resource Futures, Sam Reeve. Welcome, Sam.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, everyone. Also really pleased to be having this conversation this afternoon. As Carolyn said, I'm CEO of Resource Futures. Resource Futures provide technical consultancy services across the materials value chain. We work with the public, private and third sector organisations, helping them make informed choices around managing material resources more sustainably. Just a little bit of oversight on how we have insight into the EPR. So we have three main service areas, all of which we've been working on EPR related projects. First, as you would expect from a consultancy, is our technical consultancy. And within that, we have experts working across policy, circular economy, waste strategy and behaviour change projects. And as I say, all of our experts in that area have been supporting either central government or producers on EPR challenges over the last couple of years. Our second main service area is data gathering, and this is where we help design and deliver data gathering projects on what materials are where and who owns them. And obviously for such a subject as the EPR, that's really important. And we have been working with DEFRA over the last couple of years on helping them repopulate their understanding of household waste composition, which is helping inform the EPR fees. And then finally, but really importantly, for us as an organisation is our communities area. And this is where we have boots on the ground projects delivering sustainability impact, circular economy impact. One of the projects that we've run for a long time is our community repaint project. It takes leftover paint and redistributes it back into local community. And we manage that on behalf of Dulux Paints and have done for many, many years. And the paint industry is looking at a sector-led product stewardship scheme, which is an EPR by another name. So we've been looking at how reuse and remanufacture can be part of that solution. And now we can get into the meaty topic and start hearing all of our views on where we are and, importantly, where we want EPR to go. What we have with the panel here is a really nice broad view across the whole value chain, if I can call it that, for EPR. Robbie alluded to this. EPR can focus on many materials and products. Our primary focus today probably is going to be around packaging, and And I think that's, what's getting a lot of column inches. It's what's probably keeping lots of us busy in a lot of part of our daily job. I think it's important within that context, though, in terms of where we're at, is to recognise that EPR isn't operating in a vacuum, is it? There are lots of other policies of one of which EPR is aiming to pull the various levers. We've got the already existing PRN system that is continuing. We've got simpler recycling, hugely connected. We have DRS, which is due to come in a few years. There's obviously ETS and the impact that they may have on how we're treating waste. And there's the plastic tax, just probably to name the main ones. That's really important that there's that suite of policies, but it also really adds to the complexity. Where we're at, the system is new. Part of the reason we wanted to run this session is because there's so many questions. We have questions as an organisations, but working with our clients, there's so many questions across the whole value chain from producers. And Brian will, I'm sure, talk to us about some really interesting things about designing packaging and things, through to local authorities who are at the end of the chain managing this waste in the household. And they're asking about their payments, but they're also asking about how do we improve that performance. In December, Pack UK shared their latest thinking on the year 2 costs with the eco-modulation, and that was really interesting to see. I think my view is producers particularly have sat up and are engaged now, and that's because lots of them have received a very big bill from Pack UK in the last quarter of last year for their payments. But that's a really good thing. The policy was brought in as part of the Resources Waste Strategy to affect change. But they're engaged, but they're asking challenging questions of the sector. And I think that's really interesting, because what the policy is doing, it's bringing an externality, it's internalising it into their balance sheet, and that will result in them asking the sector challenging questions and make improvements. So I think we're in a really interesting place. Robbie, back to you for your thoughts on where we're at, please.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say, and people really care about this, where is the money? Has the money come into the system? Where's it going? And the big thing that happened at the tail end of last year in December is that the payments, the very first payments for extended producer responsibility for packaging, were taken from the producers. Those big brands and retailers and users of packaging around the UK have had those notices of liability, and they've set up their direct debits, and the money has started to flow into Pack UK. Also in December, the money has started to flow out of Pack UK and go to the local authorities to help them to run their services that, to be frank, they have been running for decades now. Lots of this is not new. The services that you get at your doorstep, your curbside collections, in the very, very immediate short term, are going to be broadly similar. You're going to get the same packaging collections. But I think it's really important in this first, where are we? It's to recognise that the system is truly live now. I've been saying the system is live for the last 2 years because we here at Ecosurety, as a compliance scheme, have been collating all of that data from the producers for years now, a few years of the data collection. But only now is it really truly live, and we start to see some of those outcomes from where is the money being deployed and how is it being used. I think in terms of what's prescient at the moment, there's definitely eyebrows being raised around the base fees, and some nervousness around unintended consequences is the phrase that you will have heard a lot around industry. Are people just simply material switching products to something that they think will attract less of a fee? And it's less about environmental factors, doing the right thing, and more about what is it the government say a fee is going to be? What's the easiest way to decrease my costs? And of course, there is an upside and a downside to that. The upside is if the government get it right and the recyclability assessment methodology in future gets it right, then they will be switching for good. They will be heading in the right direction. And I'm sure Jane can come in and talk about switching away from just different materials to actually less material use overall through reuse systems. So that's the upside. The downside is in the very immediate short term, it's quite hard to model all of this. I've been relatively close with it and shared lots of information with DEFRA. I know, Sam, you and the team have been even closer to that data to try and help them understand what needs to be paid for and how that cost needs to be distributed. It's difficult. And I think we cannot expect it to be perfect and correct in year one. It's going to take some time to settle itself down, but at least we do have the right mechanisms in place. The final point, I think, that's really important to recognise is that it really has built better links across an entire supply chain involved in packaging. This is the kind of throwaway statement that you hear on webinars like this. Oh, we're all working together and we're all friends. Genuinely, I've been around the block a while now. I've seen this in gestation for the last several years. I think 2016 was the first time I looked at how we're going to transition to this new system that now we're in 2026. So nearly a decade of sort of ploughing on in this. And genuinely, when I sat on the PAC UK steering group just earlier this week, you see totally differing viewpoints, people coming at the same issue of how do we decrease the impact that packaging has on people's day-to-day lives and on the environment more broadly, and its role in climate change, in carbon accounting, etc. Genuinely, we are now starting to see people come together, and PAC UK, as a, yes, government-run organisation, but it does sit independent of any one vested interest. I think that's brilliant, because what it does is allows lots of different viewpoints to be held in one central place.
Thanks, Robbie. Brian, your thoughts on where we are currently?
Yeah, certainly. Sort of speaking from a manufacturer's point of view, I think we have a system in place. It's operational, which is good. I don't think the principle of producer pays is disagreed with. I think some of the mechanics of how it's been incorporated are, and a lot of people have got a bit of a shock with the bill coming through just before Christmas. Even though they've known what the fees are going to be since June, it's still a big shock when you get a bill for £300,000 come in to pay. So industry doesn't like it, but understands that it's there and they've got to work with it. I think there's still a lot of confusion as well around some parts of the legislation. Things like the de minimis, for instance, is proving almost unworkable for a lot of, especially smaller companies who it was put in place to try and help. The take back scheme part of it is extremely confusing because it's broken down into different sections, which people just can't find the workaround, and many other things like that. So the mechanics of it do need some fine tuning to get right. I think there's, as Robbie alluded to, there are still some issues with communications as well. I had a member speak to me just before Christmas, and he was convinced that the PRN system had disappeared and was replaced by EPR, even though, we've been talking about it, as Robbie said, since 2016. I think needs to be a lot better communication, especially with some smaller companies that don't have the resources to deal with this type of thing. These are the people who we're finding are being most affected. Some of the big companies have dedicated people, they've hired people to do this. The smaller companies just don't have those resources, even if they're a member of one of the compliance organizations like Robbie's. They still have to spend an awful lot of time and energy gathering data and putting it into reports for them. It's having a bigger impact, or sort of disproportionate impact, on smaller companies as far as I can tell. And the last thing I shall cover is my particular pet peeve, which is the RAM. Robbie's smiling because he knows I've talked to him about it before. Unfortunately, plastics recycling isn't simple compared to glass, steel, aluminium, and even paperboard. What decides if plastics is and isn't recyclable can be down to something very small, like the adhesive you use on the label and things like that, or the type of ink you use to print it. And the RAM as it stands at the moment doesn't reflect best practice in design for recyclability. You can look at the Recoup guidelines, you can look at Recyclass, even OPRL to some extent, which give you a very clear indication of what is and isn't recyclable when it comes to plastic. But the RAM has ignored whole parts of that. And as a result, we could well end up with an awful lot of green plastic packaging, or plastics packaging that's categorized as green, that's going to end up at a recycler and they're not going to be able to do anything with it. So it's going to put a huge pressure on an industry that is under immense pressure at the moment. That's the plastics recycling industry. So yes, there are some things we can attack immediately to help us.
Thanks, Brian. And Jane, your thoughts, please, on where we are?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to be coming at this from a reuse and behavioral change perspective. And I think the first reflection is EPR, actually fit for reuse? Has there been explicit support for reuse alongside recycling upfront? Or has it been a little bit vague, other than the fact that you only pay for reusable packaging when it enters the market once? And, given the challenges in recycling that Brian just mentioned, reuse and recycling are going to have to be real partners in this future circular economy that we need. Also, as you mentioned before, Sam, around how it interfaces with other items of policy, in terms of DRS and glass being left out of DRS in England and Scotland, there are some concerns around the impacts that EPR and DRS will have on the glass industry. And given the good recycling levels for glass and the challenges with plastic, that feels like one of those unintended consequences that you mentioned. From a consumer and citizen behavior change perspective, I'm always concerned to see, where has the consumer or citizen been considered in the design of these policies? And are we thinking about consumer rights and consumer protection as we go to market, particularly with reusables? And, I'm concerned about a possibility that I might be paying for the management of waste in my tax this year. I'm probably going to be paying for it as prices are driven up by the pressure that the EPR is putting on our manufacturers and our brands. And I may also be paying for it in the future through levies and deposits and things like that for reusable packaging. So, I really want to make sure that consumers aren't paying 3 times for our waste to be managed. And leading on to that, I suppose, is around, where those taxes now, as Robbie said, that money has been collected. How do we know that nationally and locally that investment is going in to develop a system that really does deliver change, rather than subsidizing, a system that has some faults in it already that need to be addressed? So those are my initial reflections.
Great, thanks everyone. We're each going to give I suppose our highlights of what our top 1 or 2 priorities are and hopes are for EPR over the next couple of years. Thinking about this, and as I say, as a consultancy, our purpose of why we wake up each morning is we've arranged solutions, and we want to help our clients kind of understand their problems and implement solutions. And a big part of that, and particularly with EPR, is it's around a transparency of understanding where the government and now PAC UK, and then also what the PRO will be, where do they want to take this? It's really important that we understand what the current rules of engagement are, and everything, and as Ryan and Robbie has said, that's understood, maybe not completely agreed. Show me a policy in any sector of the economy where everyone is happy. For us, it's about achieving that impact, but the transparency it's critical that the right data is collected in a timely fashion, it's shared in a timely fashion, and that particularly for producers and LAs, the future needs on data is understood. You obviously have the producers having to report on the data that they're placing on market. You have the local authorities having to support on this in regarding the efficient and effective collections and all the data that they've had to provide to enable that modelling through LabCap to go on. And obviously there's also then the outcome of this. Well, where is all of this material ending up in the composition work? There's 3 really important elements of that data through the chain. And then when we take a step back and look at that and the future plans, timely requests and timely understandings, Brian alluded to it, I think, when he said, everyone knew that bill was coming, but it was still a surprise. That will continue. The reality is that we're trying to pull a lever here in a very complicated, very busy value chain in terms of people are busy. This is just one part of their job. It's a really important part. But all those stakeholders need to understand why am I having to report this data? The biggest frustration we've had for over 20 years of working in this space is why collect data if you're not going to use it? And that's really important. I think explaining what value is this data. Why do we want to know where your product is sold in terms of the nation data? It has a real impact on how that material is managed. The LA improvement action plans are really important. And they're really important because I think that's the inflection point where Jane was talking about behaviour change and the consumer, the LAs, whether that's an in-house waste collection service or an outsourced collection service that they're operating. A really important part in this chain and understanding the data is us as consumers and what we do when we finish with that bit of packaging, the really simple action of going, where am I putting this? And that's important because we know from 20 years of working on behaviour change that just putting the right system in place won't necessarily get the materials in those right streams. What are the changes that local authorities need to do that actually result in more material that is recyclable being captured in the recycling and ends up being recycled? Because that is very much the focus as I see the policy at the moment. The thing that jumps out front of mind, it's this word, and those of you that know me will have heard me say this before, it's this we need to collaborate. It's probably one of the most used buzzwords in all the conferences we go to, but the reason it is used so much, this word collaboration, is because this is a complex, knotty issue. We're trying to unravel and understand which levers we need to pull to make it simple. But understanding what actions that these policies need to affect for consumers. And now that we have the RAG eco-modulation information of what a red material will get next year compared to your base fee of amber and your green, asking the question from a local authority perspective for its efficient and effective collections of going, great, what do I do to move my collection service from where it is to an improved service? And what does that mean for my payment? But also really important, what does that mean from an actual performance measure? And then finally, we cannot forget about reuse. Understandably, and possibly rightly so, now there is a lot of talk, a lot of focus about recycling. It's really important that we don't have an unintended consequence of baking in actions and policies and cultural norms that then reuse is a whole different exercise culturally and socially than recycling. And I think that's really important that, you know, there's levers that this policy can help support as well. Jane, I'll hand over to you to carry on.
Yeah, 100% in agreement with you there. 3 things for me. I think just initially really zooming out, comms are really important, right? Like, I need to see the vision. What's the big vision for a circular economy to kind of justify the pain that we're asking, you know, your members and you to go through, or businesses to go through, and our consumers to go through in the future. And I really hope that the circular economy growth plan that is due to come out this year can really like sell that vision and really elevate that vision. And at part of that, I will be looking for those targets and those metrics for reuse, because at the moment we're in a situation where what hasn't been measured hasn't been managed. So first of all, yeah, that vision for a circular economy needs to sink through. Specifically on the EPR legislation and building on what you were saying, I want to see it categorically and explicitly supporting reuse and repair alongside recycling, obviously in line with the waste hierarchy. And as you were saying, Sam, you know, we focused on recycling because it's what we know, it's an established industry. But there is an argument for actually leading with the hardest thing, and then other easier things would then follow. So I think there's something around the ambition there. And I think what would make a difference, well, as came out in our Global Reuse Summit that City to Sea ran in March, a significant proportion of EPR fees needs to be invested into reuse infrastructure to match fund the kind of investments we're looking at from industry. Because, you know, we need logistics, we need washing facilities, we need sorting, all of these things. And it's not fair for us to say, well, you as a brand should foot the bill for that. As you said, collaboration, match funding, a kind of group commitment to this infrastructural change is really important. And the tax that's collected through EPR could well be put to good use there. And that's what we're seeing in places like France, where 5% of EPR fees are invested into building reuse infrastructure and campaigns. I think it's also important to kind of address those barriers to businesses looking at investing in reusables and keep levelling that playing field. So, you know, it's brilliant that you only pay for reusable packaging once, but that year you're going to pay quite a lot, right? Because You're going to buy the packaging is going to be heavier weight, it's going to be better materials, and you're also going to have to account for the carbon in the same year. So if I work for a brand and I go to my boss and say, this is what we're going to do, that might not land very well. So I wonder if there's an opportunity for the legislation to consider phasing the payment of EPR fees on reusables over a longer period, and that might incentivize brands to enter the market, because we want to just break down as many barriers as possible. So that's on the actual legislation. And then looking at the behavior changes, like, I completely agree. I'm concerned that we're going to miss an opportunity to graft reuse as a, systemic and consumer behavior change kind of paradigm shift onto recycling behaviors. And that would be a real missed opportunity, because in a couple of years' time, when I pick something up off my shelf and I think, oh, where did I get it? What am I supposed to do with it? There's the distinct possibility that reusables will end up in the recycling bin, recycling will end up in general waste, and we will have a failure. So I think what I'd really like to see happening would be moving from confusion to clarity, and explicitly kind of developing a shared language around packaging. First and foremost, that packaging has a value, and that works across recycling or across reuse. You wouldn't chuck a fiver in the bin, but realistically, that's what we're doing. And I think we need to make that case on a national level with national communications. But then really clarify the sort of taxonomy of reuse and recycling with a very clear use of language that's used consistently across industry, that whether you live in Bristol, whether you live in Glasgow, you understand what means what, and there is integrity within the labelling and within the certification. Because the other thing that we need to be careful of is green claims and, things coming to market that aren't truly a part of a reuse system or part of a recycling system. And nobody wants that, especially those businesses that are investing in really, really doing the right thing. And I guess my final piece would be around making sure that that market is fair. And in terms of the consumer behaviour change and the messaging, it will be hammering it home, saying it again, and keeping on saying it.
Thanks, Jane. Brian, your thoughts, please?
Yes, sure. Everyone's already talked about unintended consequences, but material shifting isn't the only unintended consequence. I think one of the issues that I have with the whole system is the fact that it's based on recyclability. And as Jane has already said, recyclability isn't the only option, and recyclability isn't the only outcome. There are emissions to take into account. You may be shifting material away from one to another, but that may have worse environmental consequences. And I think we have to be very careful about that. It may increase food waste. Again, if you're punishing some of the very high performing packaging formats like multi-layer plastics, which do extend shelf life of most foods and reduce the losses, it is a serious consequence to take into account. And one thing that I found in the last couple of weeks is that some producers, both of packaging and of products, are moving production overseas because it's actually cheaper and easier for them to do it from there and import it into the UK than to actually produce here. So these are things that need to be looked at in a little bit more detail as the legislation develops over the next couple of years. Jane has already talked about reuse, so I won't go in that area. But one of the consequences of putting the DRS system out there is that it's removing the profitable streams of recycling from local authorities. Both aluminium and PET are where most local authorities make their money on recycling. And if you're taking a big chunk of that out of them, it leaves the system more difficult to operate for local authorities because it's less profitable. So we have to keep that into consideration as well. So going forward, I think we've got to address those critical issues for manufacturers and recyclers, to be quite honest. The de minimis, which is proving unworkable, the RAM, which I've already talked about, the communications bit, but also fraud as well. Lots of members are reporting their competitors are fraudulently doing this, importers are fraudulently doing that. It is hard to get evidence on that. And whatever evidence we do collect, we do pass on to the EA as we can. But it would be good to get more substantial evidence on that so that our members aren't continually emailing me complaining that X down the road is doing this and isn't reporting their products. So fraud is an area that we haven't talked about yet. And I think the other thing we need to do going forward is to build trust in the system. And I think there is a lack of trust from certainly a lot of manufacturers in the system. That could be easily changed by ring fencing the money raised. At the moment, it's not ring fenced. And a lot of people see that although there is an obligation on the local authority to improve their services, they don't have to spend the money on waste management. So ring fencing that material because you're collecting it for that purpose would put people's minds at rest, I think. I think that clear and concise communications part is very important to build that trust. And another point, which is a lot of the decisions, a lot of the committees within PAC UK are headed or run by the obligated producers. The obligated producers aren't the only people who are involved in this value chain. And getting your voice heard as a packaging manufacturer can be difficult because you don't have or have very little representation at the top table. So these are things that could be easily changed to build that trust within the system.
Thanks, Brian. Robbie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just responding to Brian's last comment there, and using that as a jumping off point, I think it's fair to say that the producers are slightly over-indexed in terms of the influence that they can have on some of the decisions, or just access, maybe not influence actually, but sort of access to understanding what's going on, confidence in the system. Now, I believe that's why a producer responsibility organisation that is producer-led but has members from the whole value chain is something that needs to happen, so that PAC UK itself, as the scheme administrator, as the overseer of the whole thing, can actually take even more of a step back than it already has. And I don't mean to imply that it is under undue pressures, because it's a government agency and they ultimately are responsible to the four nations' governments, and that has borne out. But I think from what the sentiment of Brian's point is right. What introducing a new PRO into this system will do, other than make it another thing that's slightly more complicated to get one's head around in how the whole system works, the upside of that added complexity is that it gives a fair and appropriate home to the voice of the producers who at the end of the day are directly taking the burden of this bill. Now, they're making business decisions to pass that on through the products that we buy, so it doesn't necessarily have to hit their bottom line year on year for the rest of time. It may be baked into the cost of goods and contribute, in fact, to inflation potentially. But actually, they are that single point that are paying the bills at the end of the day. And ultimately, they need to be able to have a way to organise themselves and exert some control over those costs. You mentioned these efficient and effective collections, which can often be in tension with one another. I think a big focus, as well as appointing that PRO in the coming months, is to get these pilots started with the local authorities. And that will help to build confidence in the system that this isn't a stick to be beaten over the head with for these local authorities looking to make improvements, but is actually an opportunity to get some support. You know, it can be very lonely in a local authority with, say, a lower performing system to try and get any sort of support and advocacy help to turn things around and to improve the provision of services, the recycling rates for certain demographics and certain locations. So I see this as an opportunity. Yes, I am an optimistic person, and I would always say that kind of thing. But really, I'm hoping that these pilots will give us some confidence in the system. It's going to be a while until the data is mature in this system. That's the reality of it. And I've been asked about this time and again. Surely all of these producers know exactly what packaging materials they're using, and they can grade this recyclability assessment in a heartbeat. The reality is the data is immature. The methodology itself has only been published for just over a year, and it's been tinkered with in that time, so changed. So you have to re-look at all of your packaging formats. There are millions of different packaging formats in the UK. And people say, well, a bottle's a bottle. It's not, unfortunately, because sometimes those bottles are made of card these days, and sometimes that card has a plastic lining, and sometimes that plastic lining is very, very thick, and sometimes it isn't. So it literally is millions of different formats that we're looking through here. Now, Ecosurety and other compliance schemes are helping, are speeding up this process because we aren't starting at the absolute beginning. We have been collecting packaging data for many years now, and we've been looking at the templates for how we would fill out and automate and make easier the system with which you interact to codify your packaging. But at the end of the day, things like AI aren't going to tell you what the barrier coating on an item of packaging is at the moment. It just won't give you a credible and accurate answer. So what is happening is that either producers of packaging are looking at it themselves, or they're speaking to their suppliers to find out the facts of every single item of packaging. And I think we need to anticipate that it's going to be at least another few years before that data is really mature enough that we can be confident in it. And unfortunately, that means having a bit of grace in the whole system. I know we're all keen to make it work right now, but it's going to take some time to embed.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for the conversation so far. We're now going to open up the conversation to the floor, and we already have a list of questions to pose to our speakers. So let's get started. I'm going to start off with a question from Richard. How will the regulation be enforced? Will producer data be audited and penalties applied to those reporting inaccurately or not at all? Would you like to answer that one, Robbie?
Thanks, Caroline. It's literally already started. So the environment agencies around the 4 nations, they're devolved. So there's one in each of the UK nations, have already been going to producer sites. We've had members of ours visited to look through what data they have so far. Coming back to my previous point about a bit of grace, in the first year of that, it's, hey, look, you're misinterpreting things here. We appreciate that this is not necessarily deliberately and fraudulently misinterpreting things. This is trying to embed. What I imagine will happen over time is that there will be some leniency given in the first instance around classifications and just getting up to speed with understanding how to report your packaging. But over time, that will decrease. And we saw this in the previous system of packaging producer responsibility when we just had that old PRN system, is that in the first few years, there was some grace. But eventually it's like, hey, this system's been running for a decade. Unfortunately, it's not good enough to say, I wasn't aware of the law. I didn't know you had to grade it for recyclability. If in doubt, I decided it was green and recyclable. All of these things will not be allowed increasingly over time. So I think the Environment Agency have done a good job so far in balancing the need to ensure people have confidence in the system and that they are giving good advice so that the data gets better, but they're blending that with the reality that they can't go throwing out fines early on because it's just a little bit unfair to business. While we know this has been coming for years, and I've known, and lots of businesses have known, the exactitude of what they need to do has only been known for a very short time, and it keeps getting updated and changing over time. So I think, again, a little bit of grace there, but my own personal view is that the Environment Agency in England certainly are doing a good job with those that are in the system, making sure that their data is correct. And furthermore, with trying to get as many companies aware and registered as possible. I think the vast lion's share of packaging that's placed on the market in the UK, people are reporting. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't some on the fringes who still don't know or who are burying their head in the sand. That might be a reasonably high number of organisations by count, but in terms of tons of packaging moving around the system, I think it is very small because the very biggest producers are doing the right thing.
Thank you, Robbie. We also have a question from Jennifer, who has asked the panel to comment on EPR in the context of the British Islands beyond the mainland, i.e. places like Jersey. Can I direct that to you, Stan?
Yeah, sure. I think this is an important element to ensure the policy is fair and equitable, I guess, is one lens to look through this. We've been doing some work for Zero Waste Scotland, and they've asked this very question really, of how with their Highlands and Islands population, which is obviously very remote, and all the challenges from a waste management perspective that brings, what are the implications for the various policies, including EPR? How can we view, from a local authority perspective, the efficient and effective metrics? How does that look for the Highlands and Islands? And I guess it would be the same for any remote population, whether that's mainland or not. I think, again, maybe I would kind of follow on a bit of a view from Robbie there of going, it's really important that research is done and understood, and that research is from a perspective of those local authorities and those practitioners and waste management companies, because they aren't the same. It's, we know this, and any of us that work within the sector, it's such a complex system that we're part of here. But it has to work ultimately. But maybe this grace period that Robbie is talking about is applicable here as well, of understanding, well, the payments to local authorities, are they fair and equitable for those remote populations when maybe their efficient and effective metrics are unit different costs because of that distance and the ability to access markets, etc., etc. So I think it's important that it's recognised, it's an issue. We're aware that various governments are looking at this, but I think it's one of those things of, in time, once this policy beds in and we see how the money is flowing, exactly how do we make sure it is fair? I think it's my view on that.
Thanks, Sam. Our next question here is from Ananda, and she asks, EPR is meant to drive better packaging choices, but there's a risk producers could be pushed towards materials that are cheaper under the new fee structure, yet harder to recycle in practice. So how is this being managed in the UK system? Brian, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I think the very short answer would be it isn't being managed at all. I think the practicalities of it are that the fees are collected based on what it costs local authorities to sort and dispose of those materials that they collect at curbside. So if it doesn't cost very much for paper and board to be collected, sorted, disposed of, but it costs a lot for glass to be collected because of its weight, because it's more difficult to handle, etc., then the fees for those hard to manage materials are going to be much higher. And that is sort of pushed through to the design of products as well, and the choice that products manufacturers will use for the material for their packaging, because those fees will force some manufacturers to rethink what they're doing. And certainly in the plastics area, we've seen this with people moving from some glass packaging into PET packaging. I disagree that it's more difficult to recycle. PET packaging is very easy to recycle, as easy as glass. But we're also seeing a lot of people moving out of flexible packaging into paper as well. And, there are these nuances in the system that it's driving, but there is no sort of central management of that within the EPR fees. It's just essentially based on weight.
Thanks, Brian. Our next question comments that Sam talked about behaviour change in terms of producer design and the RAM, and Jane in the context of reuse. But what about litter reduction? The EPR regulations in their current form feel like a missed opportunity on this issue. Jane, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying before, really, is that this is an opportunity to consider consumer behaviours and citizen behaviours as these pieces of legislation are implemented. And littering, yes, is a part of that. I think I'm delighted that we're actually taking the focus off putting the responsibility onto the individual and actually putting it into the system. But in theory, if the overarching message is packaging has a value, and it does have a value, particularly if you have DRS coming as well. We all remember halcyon times gone by when people picked up bottles and got 20p. If this really is effective, then people will start to understand the value of packaging, and then will reconsider the littering choices. Also, if our local authorities are better funded, then perhaps they'll be better able to manage the waste that they're having to deal with. I know fly tipping is a huge problem. So, in theory, I think there's parts of this legislation that is actually addressing the challenge of littering, although not explicitly. But I do think there are big opportunities, for us to really focus in on citizen and consumer behaviour as complementary to the legislation as it comes through.
Thanks, Jane. The next question is from Andy, who asks, how do you see EPR influencing packaging design? Are you expecting to see reductions in hard to cycle formats like multi-layer plastics? Brian, this sounds like one for you.
Yes, you are going to see reductions in hard to recycle formats because they're going to be more expensive. And not only are they sort of 10% more expensive this year, they will be 20% and up to 50%. It's going to step up that difference over the next couple of years. So that is a very big driver for companies to move it. Packaging design isn't only about recyclability, it's also about weight. Lightweighting has always been a big issue within the industry, certainly within the design industry, because obviously the heavier something is, the more expensive it is. But when you're talking about luxury goods, then you'll probably be making your packaging heavier, more robust because of that whole brand experience. But sort of more commodity-based products have been moving to lighter for many years. And if you think something like a Coke bottle, I think it's about 50% of its weight than it was in 2014 or something like that. You know, companies have already taken as much material out to save money, rather than just for EPR. So I think there will be some more moves in that direction. The choices will be making to use less material, therefore you pay less EPR fees, as well as moving out of those hard to recycle formats. But as I said earlier, moving out of those hard to recycle formats may have other consequences that is not just about the recyclability of that packaging. And then when you're talking about multi-layer plastics, at the moment they are difficult to recycle, but in the future they may not be. When we have the advent of more chemical recycling perhaps coming into the UK, they will find a natural home there. And so if you're going to punish them and get rid of them now, and they're doing a very good job with, extending shelf life of food, you're going to lose that for the future.
Thank you, Brian. I think we might have time for a very quick answer for the last question. From Stephen, could the additional admin and financial burden of EPR on retailers reduce the variety or availability of own brand ranges, potentially limiting options for price-sensitive consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think reuse comes in here, right? Because I think own brand and reuse go really well together. And the reason for that is because if it's own brand, potentially the retailer is going to be much less wedded to very differentiated packaging. So we know that we need standardized packaging to introduce reuse. So I think that takes out a blocker. And I think it also, in terms of price sensitivity, that's often like the most accessible for shoppers, particularly if you're only paying for the product, not the packaging that it comes in, and it's part of a reuse system. And we have seen success with this in Marks and Spencer's, for example, with the pre-fill trial that's still on the shelf. So I would say own brand might be a lovely opportunity for reuse penetration for the market there.
Thanks, Jane. And that really is all we have time for today. Thank you all for joining us, and special thank you to Brian, Jane, Robbie and Sam for sharing your insights. Do also keep an eye out on our website and LinkedIn page for news about our next webinar, which we will be announcing soon. And other than that, have a great day, everybody.